Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to a realm where reality intertwines with the inexplicable, where the boundaries of reason dissolve into the shadows of uncertainty. Welcome to the political twilight zone. I am your guide through this enigmatic labyrinth, where politics and power take on life of their own. In this dimension, the threads of truth weave a tapestry of intrigue, challenging our perception of the world we thought we knew. In this world, nothing is as it seems, and the truth lies buried beneath layers of deceit. Prepare to venture where reason meets the unexplained, and where the unexplained might just be.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the weekend again. And, of course, it's a holiday weekend. We hope all of you are enjoying yourself. Although where I'm at, and where many of you at, it has turned from spring to summer instantly, apparently. You know, I always enjoy the 10 to 20 degree change in temperature coming out of nowhere. I'm being facetious there, but anyway, it's at least there's no snow. That's all I can say. Well, folks, if you're traveling, all I can say is be careful. There's a lot of people on the road. There's a lot of people in airports, by the way. If it's possible to travel by air anymore and not have a problem, that's the exception rather than the rule. My experience with people have been if you get 10 people that travel by air over a weekend, 5 of them at least, or 6 of them at least, will have some sort of major difficulty, but they got through it. And a couple will have an annoying difficulty, and one person will realize that they've been charged an enormous amount for an extra bag. So, by the way, if you go through and look at some of the wait times that you have in airports, and then the flight time, you're better off driving places, or you're really right on the same schedule. We forget that all this time in these airports, and it just burns up time. And if they can't get you on and in the air, then if you'd rather be sitting in your car than sitting in the airport. So you got to look at that stuff. There's 2 or 3 places anymore that I was going to go that it's easier to drive to. I got my stuff. They don't have any weird TSA agents, patting me down and trying to take the extra 1 ounce out of a hand sanitizer and throw all of my stuff away. So hopefully you guys are enjoying yourself. What is going on with the nation, by the way? I have some notes here, and frankly, they're just so depressing. Is there anything that the Trump administration can do that a federal judge someplace, usually appointed by Biden, by the way, there's a lot of them. A bunch of them got appointed in 2024, when, of course, he was so cognizant of what he was doing. And these guys throw injunctions out. I mean, the request comes through the door. I'm not even sure they read them. They stop. Trump must stop. The latest one that I was looking at was the Department of Education. They want to get rid of a great number of people. So, of course, Biden appointed judge says, well, yeah, do that, because it must carry out the duties and responsibilities outlined by the Enabling Act from Congress, right? Because that's how this happens. These agencies get created. Congress creates an agency. They create some rules and regulations, just a little bit. And then they essentially say, and the agency will generate rules and regulations consistent with the mission, right? Kind of like that. So when you think about it, how does that work? I mean, how much control can the congressional piece have over the executive branch execution of it? This is a really interesting question. Not an interesting question. This is a very important question. Because what this judge is sort of saying or implying, we'll see how far it goes, is that Congress can lay out the rules and the executive branch has to follow those rules exactly. This is where it gets cute. I guess the court's interpretation of what Congress wanted to do. That's probably where it's headed. Now, wouldn't that have been interesting? Just spitballing here. If somebody would have tried to do the other way and say, say that ICE under Joe Biden should actually follow the law, should actually do the things for which it was empowered. There's several agencies out there that became moribund, I think is the expression to use, during the Biden administration, and were either not used properly, not used at all, or misused terribly. And there was no interference from the courts. And the courts, I thought, were so important, aren't they? They know so much. My gosh, you walk into the room, you're just another lawyer off the street who maybe made, who knows how they decided on you. They had a political appointment usually, and of some sort. You walk in, and they swear you in, they throw a black choir robe on you, and you can't be wrong. All of a sudden, you're a lot smarter, and people have to really listen to what you have to say. Well, we need a little of that. We should respect the courts because it is one of the branches of government, and we do need to keep moving through that as we should. The problem is, of course, that it can't go on this way, where judges decide to interpret the interpretation, right? Because that's what's happening. More and more, they're deciding, well, if we can interpret the law, then we can then decide how the law should be enforced or deployed. Okay, how far does that go? Nobody knows yet. In the past, most of this stuff would have been passed on by the courts to say, look, that's an administrative decision, and administrative decisions belong to the executive branch. And with that in mind, things would have gone on. And unless there was some really big problem, some monumental issue where it was clearly off base from what was intended, and even if it has an unconstitutional piece to it, if you'd like to know somebody that went through that, you can look at this FDR, the early days of the Depression, when he was trying to pass all these new agencies and ways of doing business, and the Supreme Court kept telling him he couldn't do that. Of course, his answer was to just put more people in the Supreme Court, threaten that, and all of a sudden the Supreme Court got a lot more cooperative. But they were essentially trying to do that. And when you read the cases and what FDR was trying to do, some of it with administrative acts, some of it, through it was not something that you can imagine someone would be authorized to do. However, the stuff with Trump, at some point you have to say, well, if you're going to run the agency, can't you decide who works there? That seems like a reasonable thing to say. Does that mean that you can't fire anyone, but unless it's for an act of Congress? Well, if that's the case, then Congress should hire everybody that works in the agencies too, right? Or the courts, maybe. Maybe the courts should do it. You put your application in, judge come in, decide, if you're going to work there or not. Think there's an absurdity to this, that when you start really thinking about it and seeing where it leads, it's like, look, you have to have some guardrails between the three sections of government. And all of a sudden, the judicial branch has launched itself towards the executive. And we know why, but you can't have 637 different appointees out there, many of which were appointed by Biden recently, just deciding to scribble things on bits of paper and try and change the country's foreign policy, the hiring practices, and everything else from the executive branch. Now, there are some things that are clear. The executive branch cannot violate the law. Say they can't violate the civil rights laws or some of the laws about employment, that kind of thing. And this is where it gets fuzzy. The courts will try and, under this administration anyway, try and overlay what's called, if you read it carefully, a property right. There's this idea, and it's understandable, that you acquire some sort of property right in your position with the government. That there's sort of a little kind of social contract there between you, and that in order for you to be removed from that position, perhaps you need some sort of due process. Now, this is the key to everything. And anybody that was awake during a constitutional law class in law school will tell you that this is where it gets weird. Because it's easy to say that the Constitution requires due process before an action is taken. But then, and here's the question you can write in big letters, what process is due? How much process? Should they appear in front of an administrative law judge? Should they have a hearing? Should they be able to call witnesses? Should they be able to cross-examine witnesses? Should they have, a three-judge panel? What's the level of process that you're entitled to? The idea is that the more important to the right, the higher the process. This is why if you're going to get locked up for a criminal offense, you have a lot of process rights. Juries, things like that. And as you go down the rights column, it gets less. Thanks for staying around, folks. I appreciate it. We're back. I was probably a little disjointed in that first segment. I have these notes, and when I look at them sometimes, after I've made them and I haven't looked at them for a little while, I have to just like reset somehow, because there's so much going on and so much confusion out there. Let's face it, they're very supportive of President Trump here. But there's some things that I can't see where they're going. I'm trusting that there's a direction, there's a plan in there. But this fighting with the tariffs has started to get a little confusing to me. We are really starting to see some damage on the horizon. The EU, European Union, isn't really falling in line, I think, like the administration thought they would. They're fighting back. Well, that's because the administration thought they'd realize was in their best interest. But no, remember, the reason you're upset with them is they're kind of dumb. So why do you expect them to respond in the way you expect them to? And so they're being difficult. There's really nobody that's not being a little difficult. Obviously, we did something with Great Britain. We really need to get something pushed through with India. And the China talks continue. But China is, of course, an enigma. And they're also difficult to nail down on what they're saying because it changes every day. And they act like they didn't say what they said yesterday, today. It's like, what? No, we've always been this way. Oh, okay. Well, yesterday didn't happen then. This is kind of their approach. And they do want to straighten something out with the United States in terms of manufacturing and tariffs. When you look at the two economies, now, China has an enormous economy. Let's be fair. It's really right behind us. They don't have the standard of living individually, the per capita income, but they have a lot of per capita. So they are big markets, and they have a lot of labor. And now they're having a lot of technical expertise. But they need to sell that to somebody. Well, not just everybody can buy it. The level of the stuff that they want to build and sell, a lot more appealing to European and American nations because of the ability to have, it doesn't feel like it, but disposable income. They can sit it out for a while. The difference is, of course, that the Chinese control their media and the information that people hear. Not all of it. It's not as effective as, say, North Korea, but they really do control it, and they control the companies. We don't. So when we're trying to have essentially what's a game of economic chicken with someone, our media, who's already decided that Donald Trump and anybody that's associated with him are, anti-democratic maniacs with really there's just actually no evidence of that. But anyway, so they're going to attack him constantly over everything. So his ability to move forward, the Chinese think, is more constrained because he has a lot more pressure on him. Now, the kind of pressure you have in China on the upper levels there, say Xi and people like that, is that they keep power, and it's a dictatorial power, let's not kid ourselves, but they only keep it when there's enough cooperation from the people. Now, we all know that government is supposed to be the consent of the governed. Well, that's only sort of true places. And in places like China, they've never known a whole lot of different kinds of government. They've always been some sort of, at best, some sort of monarchy or distributed warlords, or you name it. They never have a Jeffersonian democracy over there. So applying those kind of rules and looking at it that way just doesn't do you any good. But what is known is that if things get out of kilter enough, and enough people in China feel as though that some kind of change needs to be made, that they can't really make the change, but they signal that to the many enemies that the person at the top has. Because that's how that works. The same thing in the Soviet Union. or rather Russia, same thing probably, is they let the people know who are right behind the chairman, the president, whatever you want to call him, Xi, that, hey, if something were to happen here and the government were to get maybe tweaked a little bit, like say somebody disappeared and a new person appeared in the job, we wouldn't mind that too bad. You wouldn't have to deal with us too much. That kind of signal is not a good one to have sent if you're at the top, because you're seldom removed by a democratic vote. Oftentimes you're removed by, I don't know, being tried for some sort of, and we're starting to see this in our country, constant corruption or this or that. All of a sudden out of nowhere these things come because the people who are wanting your job feel strong enough now to get rid of you. So Xi has this problem he's got to watch out for as well. They're just betting that the pressure on the president and his supporters, because of our press and the way we do things here, will just be a lot more immediate and a lot more strong, a lot more persuasive, if you want to call it persuasive, but in other words, rile people up more than what's going to happen there. Even though they really probably need us somewhat more than we need them in terms of a market. We do need places to sell things, and we do need places to make things. I would like to see everything made in the United States, wouldn't you? Yeah, well, that's fine. But we have had so much off-the-rails kind of work with our labor forces, that doesn't make it very easy to make something profitable. If you want to move from, say, China manufacturing, assembly, whatever, and set up, say, I don't know, outside of Los Angeles somewhere or something, yeah, your costs are going to be, going to be outrageous. The labor costs are probably going to be 3-4 times as much. The permitting, the building, everything you pay for, the power, everything's going to be more expensive by a lot. So how do you deliver the same product within the same price range that people are buying it? Now, some of the answer that's come out of people in the administration have been a little troubling. Like Walmart. Well, Walmart can take it. They can suck up some of the costs on these tariffs. Probably, to some extent, they do have a relatively large profit margin for the kind of business they are. But let's say there's a secondary thing. Let's say they do. What about the guys on the second and third tier of retail who don't have the reach, purchasing power, whatever you want to call it, to be able to absorb these costs or get them reduced by volume or whatever you want to say? They may not be able to do it. So what does that have? What does that affect? It's a little bit like the idea with regulation. Where regulations most of the time hurt little guys more than big guys. And sometimes the big guys just put up kind of a pretend fuss about some of the regulations because they realize that they can do it because of their size. But some of their competitors that are smaller will struggle to be able to comply. And so that may lessen competition. And this is what happens. Well, in the scenario we're talking about, what can happen is that, say, Walmart can sell these goods by absorbing more of the excess cost from the tariff than the second and third tier retailers can. So what's going to happen? Well, the price pressure to buy same product for less money is going to drive customers to Walmart and out of these other stores. At some point, of course, you can't maintain that. In other words, it becomes too expensive to compete with someone who has the ability to absorb that kind of fiscal irregularity. So it's not just that. There's other things that happen whenever you start shifting the economy around. And asking for changes to be made in profit centers and things like that very quickly, it is disruptive. And you can't start building a plant here today and make the product tomorrow and then somehow get the cost of that product with all the things and the way we're doing things in the United States down to where, even close to where they're being produced overseas. And we hear the Apple thing all the time because they're in everybody's crosshairs. I mean, and they're sideways with President Trump now. But an iPhone, which is already too expensive, is now, $1,200, $1,300. They would easily be $3,500 if they were made here. And that's assuming that there was a plant active and everything's going. Just the cost would be associated with it. Now, how many people would be able to buy that? What would their profit margin look like? We're not in the business of deciding how much money people should make. That's something we got to be real careful with. We had that with Barack Obama. Remember? Well, how much is enough? Well, too much is never enough, Barack, because that's the way capitalism works. You start limiting it, then people work to a certain point, and then they stop because it's not worth their time. They can't actually make sense of what's happening above a certain limit because they're not getting the benefit of it. So you just can't say that. And of course, where that leads, if you're not careful, is wage and price controls. Okay, folks, we're back. Listen, in the last segment, we're ending with the discussion or sort of the tease of wage and price controls. We brought that up before, but we seem to be spiraling towards that. If we want to keep doing what we're doing, and if it doesn't break our way pretty soon, and you want to keep things supposedly affordable, and I'm putting air quotes around that, then the governments have a tendency to turn towards trying to decide how much things should cost. And essentially how much profit a company can make. And before long, when they start getting the squeeze in that, then they realize, well, it will just put the company out of business if we do this, so we have to control wages too. We have to make some sort of wage and price control. They usually go hand in hand. At some point, when you try price controls, you eventually land with wage controls too, because otherwise you're putting people out of business even faster than you would normally. Many of you can probably remember the last time this was tried in the United States. Yes, I'll wait a moment. Yeah, Richard Nixon. The last time this was tried was a Republican president and a conservative president, assertedly. And if you study what happened there, it's a classic case. And people were saying, when I remember studying this in economics, and they were saying, wage and price controls didn't work for the Emperor Diocletian, and they didn't work for Richard Nixon. And that's true. The great example of this same kind of thing was during the Roman Empire under the Emperor Diocletian, who was having difficulties with prices and started trying to control prices through government intervention, ended up trying to control wages, and the whole thing just started to slow the economy, and eventually all you do is build up pressure. Same thing happened with Nixon. Right at first, it's like, okay, these things are under control now, but pressure builds up. Demand builds up. Producers don't produce as much because of the costs, and they don't get as much profit back. So demand builds up, which should build price up, but they can't because price is controlled by the government. And then people are sitting there working, and they can't get wage increases because the government doesn't allow it because at a certain range, because that throws off their price controls. So you see what happens. It's just a pressure cooker. It doesn't work. And the fact that people think it would work, is beyond most economists that have their feet on the ground. It's too much manipulation. And if you think about it, how is this so much different than the 5-year plan that you have in a lot of the communist countries, where you're trying to plan the economy? Because that's essentially what you're doing, isn't it? Aren't you trying to plan the economy when you're deciding how much the price of things is going to be, and then how much the cost of labor to produce them is going to be eventually? Aren't you just planning the economy? Maybe you're not calling it a 5-year plan, but maybe you're not even that organized. Who knows? You're just doing it and hoping something happens. cooling the economy. There are all kinds of little things that get said about it. If you hear somebody talk about price controls or something as a way to get things under control and, get our arms around this problem, just think about COVID. Remember 2 weeks to flatten the curve? Yeah. It's that kind of talk. It's in the same ballpark as that kind of talk. Once these things get going, they take on a life of their own. And then people get hysterical because things aren't working out. And if they've gone on long enough, they see that if they release them to, right away, then there's going to be an explosion in prices, and people are demanding wages, and it's going to create all sorts of confusion in the economy the longer they do it. But they keep doing it longer because they're afraid to do it because it'll cause a problem. So all they're doing is building the problem up. Like I said, it's like a pressure cooker. We don't want to get to that point. We have to acknowledge that we are going to have to decide how much we want to pay for certain goods and services if we're going to have them made in the United States, which has just a higher standard of living, and a higher standard of living requires a higher wage. And if that's what we want, or do we want some things to be made here and some parts or some things to be made elsewhere? And if they're going to be made elsewhere, could we at least have them made elsewhere by somebody that, doesn't hate us or would like to see us disappear? That would be a good idea. Problem is, guessing that is a little difficult, although I don't think that figuring that out about communist China was very difficult, but people went there because the government made it easy to go there from the United States or other countries. It made it easy to have factories, made it easy to get employment. They control the economy for the most part. Now, are they doing well because of that? Oh, no. It's just what we're talking about. They can't control prices either. And wages are a big problem over there right now. You may have heard little rumblings about some, protests and so forth about wages. This is what's happening, is they're trying to control that surge of price increases and wages, trying to keep up with it because of tariffs and a disruption in their economy. So it happens everywhere. But we could have seen that China was not our friend. I mean, they haven't been our friend since what, like 1948 about? I think that became pretty clear. And I don't think we've had a period of time where we can say that they were buddy-buddy with us. But the lure of inexpensive labor, extensive government cooperation to get your permitting and plants built was just too much for many manufacturers in the United States. And what happens is if you're in a business and say you're making TVs, as you may know, we don't make televisions in this country anymore. That went away quite some time ago. But let's say you were still Sylvania, just to conjure up an old name, and your competition, the people that you were selling around, went to China and were producing their products at 30% less than what you could produce it. Well, how long are you going to stay in business? I mean, it's not going to work. So you end up going too, even if you don't want to, but you'd like to stay in business. So once somebody breaks that wall and decides that they are willing to accept another nation who isn't really buddy-buddy with our own government, but they're friendly to you, then it's a cascading effect. Because just a few companies going over there will put their competition at such a disadvantage in costs that the other companies either go out of business or they start finding a way to make things cheaper too. And the easiest way to do that is do the same thing as the original companies. So that's how you lose these businesses. And you also lose these businesses when you decide that you have interest groups that are important to your voting. Now, this is not a new idea. It's been around since, I want to say 1 million BC, maybe something like that. But supporters who you want to make sure that they know that their sustenance is coming because of your largesse. And so you just keep pumping that up. And for a long time, the Democrat Party did this with unions. And there was a time and a place for unions. Some of them were quite good and quite necessary because of the industrialization and things that were happening, particularly in the late 20s and early 30s. But at the same time, they become self-creating. They don't address problems anymore. They find ways to continue to exist. And to continue to exist, they have to be constantly advocating for better benefits, more money, this, that. Otherwise, there's no reason to get any kind of support from the worker. And if they get enough support from the worker, then they're rich. And they can do things with legislatures, like not have right-to-work laws and allow closed shops and things like that, where if you got a certain kind of industry and you get into it, you got to join a union. These are very difficult. It doesn't mean unions are bad per se. It just means that we've sort of allowed them to run wild. And what's happened with them is not the workers. It's the people who are very high up in the unions. Because they can't say, oh, well, that was good. We did our job. Everything's pretty good now. We're just going to fade away. Well, they're not going to do that. They're going to continue to find problems, and they're going to continue to advocate for things that people will support. And people are always going to support getting more money, more benefits. And everybody's going to do that. So that just goes on and on. And when you see that as a voting block and a source of campaign funds, a big one, because they take them out of their unions' members' pockets, you start catering to them and you make their job easier. So the union will like you better if the National Labor Relations Board is friendly to the way the union wants to do business. And that cycle just gets going. And before you know it, you're Detroit. And you don't have an industry anymore. Everything is just fallen to pieces. And the whole place has just sort of drained itself dry. And that's where you end up. Now, Detroit says it's fighting back and coming back. I guess it might be a little bit, but it's still, if you look at their population, where their population in the city of Detroit now versus where it was, say, in 1965 versus where it was in, say, 1925, you'll find that the population matches up with a long time ago much better than it does in the 60s and 70s because the jobs aren't there. And this is, of course, one of the diaspora of the workers across the country. This is one of the reasons that people from the South, individuals that were fairly untrained in the things that they were doing down there, unable to really make a lot of money, saw the manufacturing jobs in the North, places like Detroit, as a good way to get ahead. So they moved there. And many of them moved to inner cities and so forth to have access to the factories. Then as those begin to shut down and the jobs begin to go away, there wasn't a way to follow those jobs because the jobs went away. They went to another country. Now, we've got places that are, they're building in some of these non-union states like Tennessee, and we're having, Mercedes-Benz, we're having BMW. These kinds of places are doing a tremendous amount of assembly in the United States in places where they're not subject to unions. Well, that's not happening in Detroit. So eventually what you have is an industry that's moved too far away for its employees to follow. And would they follow anyway? Say, hey, you can come with us. Instead of, say, $27 an hour for your work, we're going to be paying you $27 a day. And that's a pretty good wage where we're going. So if you're interested, you can pack up and come. Now, you always think that, well, if that's the prevailing wages then it's cheaper to live there. Yeah, it's usually cheaper to live those kinds of places, but also it's cheaper because they don't have the level of disposable income which attracts the kinds of devices and security and essentially luxury that we have in the United States. So you get there and you find out that yeah, you can live cheaper, but to live like you did in the United States, a lot more money there in terms of difference from the average income. And so it's going to be hard to do. People are always finding that out. And so what happens is you abandon your labor force. You have a labor force that just slowly realizes it doesn't have any place to work. And rather than lose those people or have them get mad at you and maybe move to a different industry or something, you begin to subsidize it because they're voters. And you care more about their vote, if you're a certain kind of politician, than you do about producing things for the country. So then you subsidize it through various programs. And subsidizing, or these programs they set up, for the most part, are just redistribution of income. Do they solve a problem? No. Do they continue the problem? Yes. And eventually so many people become dependent on it that it's very difficult to change. You get your voters, but your society is falling apart. There are people who out there that are representatives in Congress that come from districts that are in real trouble. Maxine Waters, for instance. And yet, they don't seem very pro-business. The solution to the problems in their districts is not to bring in more industry or business or something like that. It's to bring in more government assistance. Because that's what they understand. It's a lot easier because they are the government. And it gives them a lot of direct power over the voters. So they like that. We decide how much you're getting. Who decides? Well, you're a congressperson. You know, they pass these laws, rather these funding programs, and so, you know, you need to keep putting that same person back in there. So it grows so that sustainability in certain locations begins to just fall further and further. So what we would think of as sort of a transfer of wealth from places that are making money or producing because they have jobs and are producing things that people buy is being redirected to places where that's not happening. And it removes the incentive to chase jobs to other places. And you may be able to do better than some of the, on some of the programs. But let's not kid ourselves. We're all sort of creatures of habit. If we can do okay and not have to move and do this and do that, and we've been in the neighborhood for years, and if it's a close call, you're going to stay. Especially if the choice is between really not doing much and getting a certain amount and getting somewhat more, but working a whole lot more. Sometimes that isn't the most attractive scenario for some people. So you can't get the movement. And so many times we have tried to place manufacturing back into the inner cities, and it's never succeeded. It's just that stuff, that day is gone. Partly because you can't change that big of an area with just one or two manufacturing plants. Also, we have come to the point where our level of education and ability to do certain jobs in the manufacturing business and others like that has become very, very limited. If you want to find people, and this is what's been coming out from some of the tech companies, and you can't blame them. If you want to find a lot of people who are educated in things that you're doing in the tech industry, that have a certain level of complexity, China has got a lot of them. Because people work towards that in China because it's a way to get out of grinding poverty for some of them. And others is because the government encourages it and discourages underwater basket weaving and DEI studies. They don't see them as particularly productive to their economy. So you can find skilled workers in a place like that, whereas you have to pay more in some instances for workers in the U.S. who don't have the skill set because apparently people didn't think we needed it. And we've been sort of, poo-pooing blue-collar labor and even complex topics in college. If you want to see an example of it, look at accounting. Certified public accountants, which is an important job, really, to understand the complexities of accounting, and especially what happens now, because accounting works heavily with the tax code in many instances, which is wildly unnecessarily complex. So it's not an easy job, and it requires a certain amount of dedication. It requires a certain amount of work, and that's just been dropping off. People coming out of college to be CPAs are just, it's not coming out enough to support them. There's others too. Look at pharmacists. Now, I think that's a little better now, but for a while, pharmacies could not find pharmacists. Being a good pharmacist is, there's a rigorous kind of educational piece you have to go through. Not just sailing through, learning about how bad capitalism is and getting an A for that. You actually have to know things. And so that becomes a little less popular, right? And eventually, you don't have the people to fill those jobs. So it's these kind of technical, quasi-technical jobs that we lack, and the skill set that goes along with them, especially now in the tech industry and some of the other pieces of it. And this is where it really gets uncomfortable. Our education system is so failed. Let's take out of the picture that people decided that they could make as much money being a DIA court, diversity instructor, or run a diversity department in a company. That would be a better choice than, say, becoming, electrical engineer, or I want to think something like anything in engineering, business, stuff like that. We need those people. We need people in the liberal arts. That's always kind of an important part too. But everybody can't be an English major. It's just not going to work. And we have been slowly, over time, directing people away from those kinds of things. Plus, we've got a population that we don't give them the skill sets early on to really be gravitating towards those kinds of jobs. Look, if you're not getting what you're doing in math by, say, the 8th grade, you're not going to want to go on to do some kind of technical work in college that requires mathematics. You don't have the basis for it, and you're struggling. And the idea of taking that on where you're going to be way behind some other people, or it's going to be a lot harder for you because you don't have the basics instilled in you, you're not going to head that direction. The river flows the easiest way, right? Same thing with labor. We get better results when we reward people for working harder in areas, or being smarter or more skilled. That has gone out of favor for some reason in this country for a while. And until we bring that back, some people call that merit, our labor force is just not going to be up to the challenge. Talk to you guys next week.
Folks, thanks for listening. Listen, if you'd like to listen to more and you want to maybe perhaps have someone else listen to our podcast, you can do so either by going right to our webpage, politicalviking.com, or therickwagnershow.com. Both of them will take you there. You can get links right directly to our podcast, or you can hear our podcast on Podbean, on iTunes, and Spotify, and a couple others. So you can find us. We appreciate it if you do. And if you've heard the show, you want somebody else to hear it, that's a good way to send it to them. Thanks for listening.